Oh, hey students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 17, Lesson 2. Today we're learning about the early years of the war. Today's lesson is a bit of a doozy. It's essentially a timeline of battle, more battles, battles on the land, battles on the sea, and so we're going to summarize, or otherwise we'd be here all day. Now, if you're really into the Civil War, and you really like this lesson, I'll add a bunch of videos so you can learn all about it. But don't feel obligated to sit and watch through all the videos, or it will take you a really long time to get through the lesson. So the videos are supplemental. They're optional. You get what you need to know just from the text. All right, let's do it. All right. Hey, the first military action of the Civil War was the northern blockade of southern ports. This happened with little fanfare as the Confederate, the Confederates didn't have much of a navy to compete. They would build an ironclad ship, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So first major land battle to take place would be the Battle of Bull Run. This was in Virginia, so close to Washington, D.C., that civilians from the northern capital actually came to watch. I don't know what they were thinking. I guess they thought it would be like a big fist fight or something, but boy, were they wrong. A larger Union force under the command of General McDowell, they moved in on Confederate forces and met with initial success, but the Confederates rallied around General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. It is said that another general, when his men were starting to run away, said, "Look at Jackson and his men, they're standing firm like a stone wall." And they pretty much called him Stonewall Jackson for, well, the rest of history. The rebels rallied sort of around Stonewall Jackson, and then they had a fierce counterattack, routing Union forces from the field, who then promptly ran into the civilians watching, who were also starting to run away because those crazy rebels had won the day. Here's my rebels. There they are. Confederate victory at the first Bull Run. All right. After that, well, Lincoln fired McDowell and made General George B. McClellan commander of the Union Army of the East, which was called the Army of the Potomac. In the West, you recall the plan was to take control of the Mississippi River, thereby cutting the Confederacy in half. Naval Commander Foote and General Ulysses S. Grant made good ground on this front, seizing multiple Confederate forts. And here is an optional video on Bull Run. Very informative. All right, Battle of the Ironclads. Every history class I've ever been in that covers the Civil War has a little portion on the Ironclads, because it was it changed naval warfare forever, for the whole world. So the Union blockade of the South was causing big problems for the Confederacy because they couldn't get any goods in or out of their ports. But they had a solution. They rebuilt this abandoned Union frigate called the Merrimac, and they covered the whole thing with iron, like 4-inch plates of iron, making it the first ironclad ship. They renamed it the Virginia. So the Virginia made a run at the northern blockade in Chesapeake Bay. Basically, it kicked a lot of butt on day one. The Union cannon shells bounced off of it. It sunk one ship and I think disabled 2 others. I gotta look at the video again. But they couldn't do anything to stop it. And so after a hard day of kicking butt, the Virginia backed off for the day. And the next day it went back to kick more butt, but there was a problem. The Union had their own ironclad ship called the Monitor. 2 pretty different designs. Regardless, neither of the ships could do damage to each other, so it was a stalemate, and the Virginia was forced to withdraw. So there goes the Confederacy's plan to use one ship to destroy the entire northern blockade. Okay, Battle at Shiloh. Off in the west, Grant was hard at work. He was massing troops near a place called Shiloh Church. He was planning on using all these troops to take out Corinth, Mississippi, which was an important Confederate railroad junction. Confederate General Beauregard launched a sneak attack on Union forces before they could fully assemble their strength, and although Union forces ended up winning, they suffered massive losses, which is sort of a calling card of the Union Army. The Union and Confederacy suffered a combined 23,000 casualties. Casualties being our vocabulary word, which means people that are injured, dead, or missing. Sort of an all-encompassing word for people that are no longer combat ready. Union forces went on to lay siege to Corinth and take it, and they were well on their way to controlling the vital Mississippi River. Shortly, a short piece on New Orleans. New Orleans was the largest city in the South, and at the southern tip of the Mississippi River, it was like taking the far end of it. Union forces took control of the city. It was mostly a naval operation. The date was April 25th of 1862. With the fall of New Orleans, the Confederacy could no longer send its goods out to sea. The last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River was Vicksburg. That means Vicksburg is the only thing standing in the way of Union complete control of the Mississippi River, which was one part of their three-part plan to basically choke out the Confederacy. Moving to the east. While in the west, the Confederacy was getting its butt handed to them. In the east, they were doing much better. The Union was trying to no avail to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Generals Lee and Stonewall Jackson kept defeating larger Union forces with their ability to utilize terrain and inspire their men. Major Confederate victories included the 7 Days Battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. We have this really cool video on sort of the what happened at Chancellorsville. But if you YouTube any of these battles, you'll find very informative videos. It is a topic very widely studied. That leads us to Antietam. Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy, had been pressuring General Lee to take the war into the north. Let's go out of the south into the north and go mess them up for a little while. So Lee marched into Maryland, which was Union turf. To confuse the Union general, McClellan, Lee broke his army into 4 separate parts and sent them in 4 different directions. In a stroke of luck, good or bad, depending on who you are, one of Lee's commanders, an officer, lost his orders, his piece of paper telling him what the game plan was, and it was discovered by a pair of Union soldiers who then turned it into their commanders, and their plan was up. Unfortunately, McClellan blew his opportunity to crush these armies piecemeal because he waited. He was a very cautious man. So Lee was able to take his 4 chunks and pull them back together just in time for a colossal battle at Antietam. This ended up being a victory for the Union, forcing Lee back into Virginia, back on the defensive. But both sides suffered massive casualties. Between the two of them, 6,000 Americans died that day, with 17,000 wounded, making this the single deadliest day of the Civil War. Here's a nice video on Antietam, if you'd like to watch it. Alright, that leads us to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Civil War for Lincoln was initially not a war about ending slavery, but a war to save the Union. As time progressed, however, opinions started to change. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass convinced Lincoln that making the war about slavery would make England and France think twice about supporting the Confederacy in any way. Remember, support from England and France and them putting pressure on the North to end the war was kind of a big part of the Confederate strategy to win the Civil War, to continue existing as a Confederacy of the United States, or the Confederate States of America. Now, Lincoln did not have the constitutional authority to just end slavery, but he did have the authority to take property from an enemy during wartime, which, according to the law, you remember the Dred Scott decision, was what slaves were. They were property, and the Confederate States of America were the enemy, so slaves in the Confederacy were property of the enemy, and Lincoln could do that, so that's what he did. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves held in the Confederacy. Now, this actually didn't free any slaves that day. It's not like their shackles were magically removed on January 1st when it took effect. But as the Union would drive through the South, they essentially liberated slaves as they went. And when they found out that the Union Army was near, slaves would rush to the army to essentially become liberated. Now keep in mind that the proclamation left slavery legal in the Union. Remember, the border states were slave states, and it didn't free any slaves there. So, though not the sweeping conclusion of slavery that is often thought to be, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did make it clear that if the Union won the war, slavery would be over in the United States. So that's your lesson for the day. It can be shorter or longer depending on how much of this you want to look into and watch these videos, but the basics of it are in the text. Reading the textbook might not be a bad idea, though I think I covered most of it. You have your basic quiz here. 5 questions, 10 points. Tomorrow we get into lesson 3, yet more battles. We're only in the early years of the war. So that's it for today. Good luck on your quiz, and I'll see you tomorrow.